Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our truly global audience. We're so happy to welcome you today. My name is Laura Rosick. I'm the director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies here at the University of Michigan. Thank you for joining us for the past, present, and future of LGBT activism in Singapore, a roundtable on Pink Dot. A little bit of housekeeping is please submit your questions via the Q&A function, and the moderator will be able to answer these questions towards the end of our webinar. Today's event format will have announcements and introductions, a roundtable discussion with the panelists, and then the Q&A. For those of you who join us for CEAS events, please note that our upcoming lecture is from Alyssa Paradis, who's a collegiate fellow here in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Michigan on Friday, November 5th. Is the Philippines Asia's Banana Republic? Vertical Disintegration After Empire. We'd like to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures and the International Institute. And of course, we always like to acknowledge the funding that provides support for these events from the U.S. Department of Education and National Resource Center Title VI grant. And now I'm happy today to welcome our panelists who are joining us from all over the world. Joining us from Singapore, Alfian Siat is a resident playwright of Wild Rice and an acclaimed Singaporean author. Also joining us from Singapore is Michelle Lazar, Associate Professor and Head of the Department of English, Language and Literature at the National University of Singapore. Joining us from London, Pavan Mano is a PhD candidate in the Department of English at King's College London. And as I'm saying that, we just asked, and Pavan is actually joining us from Singapore. So he's coming to us from there as well. Also on our panel, joining us from the East Coast is Robert Phillips, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Ball State University. And we're really happy to welcome our moderator here from the University of Michigan. Professor Adi Salim Baat is a LSA Collegiate Fellow, and we're happy that from fall 2022, he will be an assistant professor in the Department of Romance, Languages, and Literature at the University of Michigan. So welcome, Adi. Our panelists today discuss the success and limits of an annual LGBT event called Pink Dot that first began in Singapore in 2011. 10 years later, it has become clear that the Pink Dot has become a significant annual event that has led to increased visibility for the LGBTQ community. Yet despite the successes of Pink Dot, very little has concretely changed in Singapore for LGBT individuals. This past July, the Journal of Language and Sexuality published the first special issue dedicated to Pink Dot, which was edited by Pavan, Richard, and Adi. In exploring the use of language in the Pink Dot movement, the article in the special issue simultaneously grappled with the past decade of Pink Dot and explore whether LGBT activism in Singapore might be evolving beyond the relatively acceptable approach of Pink Dot strategic assimilation. And we're really pleased to be able to sponsor this today. And please welcome our wonderful panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for the introductions, and thank you to the Center for sponsoring this event. As Laura just mentioned, this is also a launch event for the recent issue, a special issue of the Journal of Language and Sexuality on Pink Dot. So to begin, I'd like to invite my co-editor, Pavan, to tell us a little bit more about the special issue. Pavan?
Oh, I was on mute. I'm so sorry. So, hi, everyone. Let me just very briefly introduce the special issue and what we set out to do. Both myself and my two co-editors, Adi and Rob, we had the pleasure of editing the latest issue of Journal of Language and Sexuality. It was titled Pink Dot: Discursive Formations, Constructions, and Contestations. And we tried to interpret this in the broadest possible way, which means that we've assembled 4 articles that are quite diverse in methodological approaches, and also quite diverse in the kind of engagement with Pink Dot discourse. Vincent Park and Mia Hiramoto's article analyzes how love, the discourse of love, is mobilized in Pink Dot and discourses around Pink Dot to expand the sorts of love that are thought of as possible. And then they compare that to conservative discourse, and they focus on a Christian ministry, and they study how the same discourse of love is mobilized to militate against queer expressions of love. And then in Rob's article, he studies the media discourse around Pink Dot and how that's reflected differently in different sorts of media. So he takes an approach in corpus linguistics, and he studies coverage of Pink Dot in state and state-affiliated media, and compares that to how Pink Dot has been covered in independent media outlets in the country. And he shows how sexuality is constructed differently in these two media spheres. He shows how sexuality in independent media is constructed in a progressive way to expand or challenge heteronormative definitions of love. And he also shows how in state-affiliated media, discourses around Pink Dot and about Pink Dot are used to militate against queer forms of love, and to reinforce established forms of heteronormative desire. My own article is interested in visuals of Pink Dot and the kind of visual layout that Pink Dot adopts in its flyers and publicity material. And so I investigate the semiotics of color and layout and typography in one of Pink Dot's posters for Pink Dot 2017. And I'm interested in showing how the process of discursive attenuation is performed through its publicity material, where potentially discordant elements of its discourse are downplayed to garner greater public support. And finally, we have Ben Rowlett and Christian Go's article that really expands the analytical scope of the issue. It highlights the transnational currents of Pink Dot and how it's moved from Singapore over to Hong Kong as well as many other sites, right? But Pink Dot and, Ben and Christian's article focuses on iterations of Pink Dot in Singapore and Hong Kong. They analyze two videos comparing Pink Dot Hong Kong and Pink Dot Singapore, and they show how discourses in both these videos converge and diverge in interesting ways, very much dependent on the socio-political context of the territory they are responding to and based in. The other significance of that article is that it challenges readings of Pink Dot as universally homo-nationalist and homonormative. The issue is rounded off with Michelle Lazar's commentary, which considers the geopolitics of gender and sexuality. And she considers also how knowledges of gender and sexuality are inflected by currents of epistemic normativities, right, which really tend to privilege theory that originates from the north and northern sites, often at the expense of sites in the south. So I hope that kind of forms the basis for today's discussion that tries to extend some of these themes that have been raised in this special issue, and hopefully we grapple with them in a more extended way in what is to come. I think I will cede the time now to our first discussant, Alfian.
All right, thank you. Thanks so much for that, Pavan. So today, I think what I'd like to do is go through a very brief history of the Pink Dot movement, and also I think share from my own experiences as one of the members of the original founding committee for Pink Dot. Yeah, so so Pink Dot is a movement, I suppose you can call it that, where people are encouraged to gather at Hong Lim Park, which is the only space in Singapore. It's also known as Speaker's Corner, where demonstrations or public gatherings are allowed. And it started in the year 2009, but actually you can possibly trace it back to a few other events. Yeah, so I think it's important to kind of look at that history as what preceded 2009, and I will point out to a few things. So one of which would be the nation parties, which is a series of circuit parties that started in the year 2000, and it was eventually banned in the year 2004. And what happened was that as a response to that, there was this event, I suppose you'd call it like a counter event, which is known as indignation. And that was started as a response to state repression, right? So for indignation, they had it started in the year 2005. That was the first iteration, and then you had 2006 and then 2007. In the year 2007 of indignation, there were a couple of events that they wanted to initiate. One of them was known as a Pink Run. So this one was when they were trying to get some people to wear pink and actually run along the Singapore River. But what happened was that plainclothes policemen turned up, told them that this was an offense under the Miscellaneous Offence Act, and then this pink run was banned. And then there was another thing also called the Pink Picnic. So people were also asked to come in pink. And this was supposed to be an event at the Botanic Gardens. Again, authorities learned about this and they were told, oh, you cannot gather here for a cause-related event. If people were found together in groups of 5 or more, then the police would come down and action be taken. So what happened was that this event was officially called off, but at the same time, the organizers communicated that there would be nothing wrong if people just turned up at the Botanic Gardens anyway, wearing pink. Yeah, so it became kind of unofficial, and I think it's an interesting moment where, you know, you could argue that this was a kind of like a leaderless kind of movement, right? Because people would sort of self-initiate wearing pink and turn up at the Botanic Gardens. So I wanted to point out that even before Pink Dot, there was the Pink Run as well as the Pink Picnic, which called upon members of the public to wear pink as a certain gesture, as a certain statement in support of LGBT causes in Singapore. Yeah, and it's interesting that before Pink Dot sort of took on, I was going to say hijack, but that's not exactly true. Well, before Pink Dot somehow articulated that the pink had to do with Singaporeans' pink identity cards, and that pink was a combination of the colors red and white on the Singapore flag. I wanted to point out that the way pink was used in the Pink Run and the Pink Picnic was because of its association with the pink triangle. And that's an international gay symbol, and is taken from the pink triangles that was used, that was forced upon homosexuals by the Nazis. And it is definitely a sign of persecution that has been reclaimed by the gay community. So the Pink Run, Pink Picnic. And eventually we come to the year 2008, because of the changes to Public Order Act, they exempted licensing requirements for exhibitions and performances in Hong Lim Park, right? So this opened up some possibilities for some activists who were thinking, okay, we should start capitalizing on this opening up. And one of them was Roy Tan. And he actually suggested having a pride parade at Hong Lim Park. And I think more people actually approached him and suggested otherwise. So we see, and that otherwise was, oh, why don't we do something more family friendly instead? Why don't we do something that might be a bit more appealing, that might be kind of attractive to straight people to come and attend, you know? So there was already, from its very origins, there was a sense that let us not do a pride parade, because that would be confrontational, because that would project certain images of deviants, of people on floats who are in various stages of undress, people who are supposedly freakish in the eyes of the conservative majority. So I think we can see that from the very beginning, if you're going to talk about Pink Dot having assimilationist or respectability politics, you can kind of like trace it to that moment. Yeah. So I was part of that initial committee that thought about what we should then do. at Hong Lim Park to replace a pride parade, right? And I wanted to say that we were not very activist minded from the very beginning. I would say that the composition of the people who came together, their backgrounds were from theater, from entertainment, from advertising, from public relations. So there weren't really very clear activist goals from the beginning. On the other hand, though, I think we all had experience in how to run a campaign. So in terms of thinking of a slogan, so the slogan for that year, the Pink Dot slogan is freedom to love, right? And that's very specific, it's very, very crafted. We want to avoid things like the right to love, for example. So it was very conscious to avoid rights-based discourses in favor of something that was really, really very general, very hopefully with broad appeal, right? So how do you argue against something called freedom to love, you know? So it was a sense that was quite unimpeachable. And of course, we came up with things like a mascot called Pinky, which was an actual round dot. And I think there's an idea that was borrowed from the Japanese who have mascots for about everything. So a little round dot with like eyes and a little mouth and arms and legs. So the slogan and the logo and the mascot, and of course the whole campaign, which was come up dressed in pink. And I think from that moment also, it was very clear we should try to attract straight people to come down for Pink Dot. And it was one of the reasons for this was to allow some kind of cover for queer people who wanted to attend but did not want to out themselves. So there's the idea that among straight people, that space would be still quite ambiguous, right? So they would provide some kind of camouflage for you. And all the ambassadors that were chosen were all straight people. So people like Neo Swee Lin, people like Rosalind Lee and Timothy Na, they came from either theatre or radio. So I wanted to say that even before Pink Dot, there were already all these spheres, all these domains and fields in which you can see that there was already some form of straight allyship. And I think Pink Dot just basically gave it like a larger platform for these people to display their solidarity and allyship with queer people. Okay, so this was in the year 2009. One important event also, I think, sort of gave momentum to this, and that was the Aware EGM in the year 2009, right, in May. So I think it gave a certain energy to a lot of people because this was an interesting instance when people felt that the liberals had won. And this is something that is very rare in Singapore. So definitely gave a kind of momentum for people who thought, okay, you know, maybe we can keep on winning and we should turn up for Pink Dot. And this was also a response to, so that where EGM, for example, there were a group of conservative church-linked women who wanted to take over a feminist organization in Singapore. And I think the numbers who turned up for Pink Dot, around 2,500, a lot of them, I think, were also taking a stand against these kinds of what they felt was religious incursions into secular space and also into their own private spaces. Yeah. Okay, so this is 2009. The year after, 2010, there was a constitutional challenge to 3778. It was put forward by someone called Tan Eng Hong. And the year after, there was also another challenge by Gary Lim and Kenneth Chi. And I will come back to this when we look at Pink Dot 2014. Somewhere around the year 2011, I think Pink Dot kind of ran into one of its earlier internal challenges, right? So I think when you look at any activist movement, you realize that there will be some quarters who would counsel a more radical approach. There would be other quarters who would advise something a bit more reformist and incrementalist. So there was this issue with Project X, right, which is an organization that was set up for sex workers. And I think they wanted to set up a booth, potentially with the slogan saying sex work is work. And I think there was this whole discussion between Project X and Pink Dot, which is if we allow you to set up a booth there, and if you put out your slogan there, people who will come for Pink Dot, and especially people who already have some ill intent towards Pink Dot, might take that photo, sex work is work, and then declare that Pink Dot is an organization that supports immorality or promiscuity, and it would jeopardize the whole movement. So I think we are familiar with these kinds of discussions, right? What do you do with certain segments of that community which you think might imperil the whole movement? So I think from Project X point of view, if we go down, then we all go down together. But for Pink Dot, it was or maybe we might need to sort of sandpaper some of the more difficult edges so that we can save the whole. Eventually, though, I think Project X was allowed to put up their booth, and I think they also were allowed to distribute their brochures and materials, but they had to be vetted by the Pink Dot organization. And Vanessa Ho does claim that this seemed like a kind of instance of censorship or prior restraint. Okay, so we go to the year 2014, and I think this is the moment when another challenge emerged. So within the internal politics of Pink Dot. So I know currently Pink Dot has been accused of being quite homonormative in the sense that it wants to project what should be the ideal kind of gay figures that the public should think about in the popular imagination, right? So in the year 2014, Gary and Kenneth, the two people who I mentioned, had launched a constitutional challenge. They were featured as flag bearers in Pink Dot. And Gary and Kenneth, they are a monogamous couple, they are Chinese, they are masculine presenting, they are middle class, yeah, and very different from Ivan, for example, you know, who's the first person, and he's actually got what you call a locus standi when it comes to 377A, because he was charged under that law for cottaging, right, for having sex in a restroom, in a public restroom. But Ivan was, I suppose, not not so ideal as this particular couple in this long-term monogamous relationship. So that's where you have homonormativity. And I think Pink Dot was criticized for that. You know, why couldn't you bring on those three people? Why were you kind of like selective about just choosing these two Chinese middle-class couple? Yeah. And then in the year 2014, the first counter movement emerged. Muslim religious leader Ustaz Noor Daros set up the Wear White Facebook page, and he urged Muslims not to attend Pink Dot. And I think this was in response to a couple of things. One was Pink Dot actually featuring a woman wearing a hijab in one of its videos. And the second thing was that Pink Dot, the date for Pink Dot for that year coincided, I think, with the first day of Ramadan, which is the Muslim holy month for fasting. So Nodarus set up this counter movement called Wear White. And then the same year, 6,000 Christians dressed in white attended family worship service that was conducted by the Faith Community Baptist Church, led by Pastor Lawrence Kong. And then Lawrence Kong, later on, he attempted to organize a Red Dot Family Day event at the Padang. And this was, his application was, I don't know, unfortunately, I think fortunately, rejected by the authorities. Okay, in the year 2015, we had the first Malay ambassador to Pink Dot, called Hirzi Zulkifli. And I think this is interesting because it comes like 1 year after Nodarus had set up his Wear White counter movement, right? So if you're going to look at, let's say, Lynette Chua's theory of pragmatic resistance, for example, I think this particular instance sort of is not an instance of pragmatic resistance, because if you're pragmatic resistance, you would actually withdraw when you see that signals from the state or from other bodies are repressive, right? But in this particular instance, in spite of the repression, people actually sort of came forward rather than became more restrained. Okay, in the year 2015, the counter movement grew. There was a network called Love Singapore that called upon about 100 churches to encourage their members to turn up for weekend service in white. And then in response to that, and I find it interesting because we suddenly had this kind of like escalation and counter escalation. In the year 2016, I think Pink Dot, I suppose, started to show its early activist stripes when the organizers distributed pink placards so that people could write individual messages of support. Yeah, so suddenly, you know, the idea of having a placard, which is something that people would carry around in demonstrations and protests worldwide, Pink Dot started assuming the appearances of an actual protest. Okay, in the year 10th anniversary, the ambassadors from the last decade actually read 10 declarations for equality. And this was interesting also, right? Because suddenly it became more political, suddenly people reading out demands, and this is something that you would expect with activist movements. And interestingly, every year during Pink Dot, so you form a dot, right? It's a huge dot. I think you can't call it a dot anymore. It's like a amorphous blob already by now. And then there would be a message. And I think in previous years, it'd be like freedom to love, etc. But in 2018, the message was, we are ready. So this is something that echoes the Ready for Repeal campaign. And you can see that Pink Dot was starting to either platform or hitch its own identity to the repeal movement and starting to become more overtly politicized. And then we go to the year 2019. And this is interesting because in that year, the message was supposed to be unity, right? But then like either a day or a couple of days before the actual Pink Dot, Lee Hsien Loong made a speech. And he said, either in the speech or interview, he said, Section 377A will be around for some time. And he continues to say, but this has not inhibited people from living and had not stopped Pink Dot from having a gathering every year. And I think this is one of the early instances in which the Pink Dot movement has been co-opted by the state. Is an interesting kind of like twisting of what its existence is supposed to signal, right? So I think recently also an Ambassador Chan Heng-chi, I think either UN or addressing an international body also said, because Pink Dot is present, it means that the state isn't really repressive against gay people. Whereas the reality is that Pink Dot is present because the state has been repressive towards LGBT people. Okay, so because of what Lee Hsien Loong said, that intended message, unity, was replaced with the words repeal 377A, right? And during that speech, Perrin Chua actually came up with a very political speech where he got the crowd to chant, tear down the law. Yeah, so I think that in the year 2019, was probably one of the most political manifestations of Pink Dot that we've ever observed. And in that same year also, in the year, in the month of November, there were 3 new constitutional challenges by Roy Tan, Johnson Chu, and Brian Chung. So just a very brief mapping of the journey that Pink Dot has taken. And I know there have been criticisms about how conservative Pink Dot is, but I think one of the things I'd like to ask is, what are the actual aims or goals of the Pink Dot movement, right? Because if we see the end goal as a repeal of 377A, then obviously you can say that after more than 10 years, why has there not been any progress that's made? Why has it been stagnating? But I think if we kind of shift the metrics a little bit, if to use a very popular bureaucratic term in Singapore, if we relook the KPIs or key performance indicators, we can, if we see that the original mission of Pink Dot was to somehow make queer people more legible to the community at large, was to somehow recruit more allies to the cause, was to raise awareness of LGBT people and their challenges and problems, to also somehow mark their presence and visibility for at least one day in every year, and to have that as a kind of commemoration and anniversary, and to show that the movement is increasing, right? Because that's what you somehow demonstrate when you show that the number of people has kept increasing every year. And surveys have also shown that attitudes have been shifting when it comes to attitudes towards queer people and whether S377A should be repealed. So if you look at those other metrics, I think one can make an argument that actually Pink Dot has been successful. And then additionally, if we look at the maybe micro political aspects, if we shift away from micro politics and all these like activist demands and goals and aims, I also do know of the value of Pink Dot as a place in which some people kind of gently come out. I know there's this ritual some young people go through where they come out their houses and they're not dressed in pink because they're so scared their parents will notice it. And then after that, they go to a public toilet somewhere and then they change in pink, or they wear a jacket and only at the Pink Dot field, they take it off and then suddenly, they're wearing pink. And it's become a kind of a rite of passage, a kind of coming out ritual for a lot of young people as well. And then I know people who go there and then they see this sea of, I suppose, very accepting faces, and that's very meaningful for them. So I'm also not going to discount those kinds of effects that Pink Dot might have beyond pushing the political needle. Okay, I think that's all for my little presentation, and I hope to have a rich and robust discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alfian. So interesting to hear your perspective, because you've lived through the movement and you've been at the center of the movement at times as well. So it's doubly interesting to hear your perspective on that matter. So let's move to Dr. Michelle Lazar.
So thanks very much. I'd like to first thank the organizers of the panel. So Professor Laura Marie Razak, Director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Michigan, for hosting the roundtable, to the three editors of the special issue on Pink Dot for inviting me to join the panel. And it's really great to meet the three editors face to face, at least today, for the first time. And also my thanks to Jonathan Valdez for excellent technical support. Also to Alfian for really providing that excellent contextual sort of background and coming from a very personal perspective. I think that really is a very meaningful start to the roundtable as well. What I plan to do for the kind of 10 to 15 minutes that I have is I'd like to actually take a stab at three questions that Pavan had actually sent me last week. Questions which I'm sure that the panel will have their own views on as well, and could then, of course, also weigh in the course of the session. So I'm going to sort of jump into those three questions that Pavan had sent, and just as I said, my preliminary stab at those questions. So Jonathan's going to sort of help me share share screen at this point. Jonathan, are you there to?
Yep, trying to get it shared.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so the very first question there really is about how likely is homo-nationalist discourse as pragmatic resistance going to remain viable as a strategy, right? So I think this is a really important question that can be considered, at least in the light of two things. Firstly, we could ask this question as a way of taking stock of the development of Pink Dot's discourse in the spirit of the theme of this roundtable, right, which is to do with the past, the present, and future, given that Pink Dot has survived 12 years. As we know, its overtly homo-nationalistic stance, that is, its alignment with national and community values, has been a tactical response to the socio-historical and political realities of Singapore's mode of illiberal governance. Hence, the idea of homo-nationalism as a strategy of pragmatic resistance that Lynette Chua has articulated, or another way of putting it might be a practice in the politics of prudence, as I've recently described. The question 12 years on is whether this stance remains useful and relevant for the movement as a whole, and if not, what has changed sociopolitically in Singapore in general, and in the mode of governance in particular. Secondly, in relation to this question is, so I think, Jonathan, you can move to the next slide. Thank you. Is this other question, right? And that is, can Pink Dot's homo-nationalistic stance continue as a viable strategy when the government uses Pink Dot's success at survival against itself and Singapore's LGBT community, right? So as Alfian mentioned, Lee Hsien Loong had raised this a couple of years prior, And this has also sort of re-emerged in the recent discussion or statement really by Professor Chan Heng-Chi, Ambassador at Large at UN on 12th May of this year, right? So this is something that Pavan had actually sent me the link to, where the government was seen as using Pink Dot as a kind of shield against international criticisms of discrimination of the Singapore's LGBT community. So if you kind of had the chance to look at, it's a very short segment really, where Prof. Chan Heng-Chi is speaking about the LGBT issues from the point of view of the government. There are kind of, you can sum up what she's saying in two moves. The first move is that the government does not discriminate against the LGBT community, right? And so Prof. Chan, and I quote her, she said, "The LGBT community are valuable members of our society. The government does not tolerate violence, abuse, discrimination, and harassment against them," right? Unquote. And then she goes on to cite the organizing of Pink Dot's annual event for the past 12 years as evidence that the government does not discriminate against the LGBT community. So very much in line with what Elkin mentioned that Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong had also said earlier. The second move in Prof. Chan's statement was that society needs to evolve, right? And this, she says, in relation to Section 377A of the Penal Code, that it will not be repealed and it has to remain because societal attitudes towards homosexuality or same-sex relations are still evolving, she says, and various communities hold different views, right? So the government has to take into account the sentiments of all. So the bottom line is, and I quote, "Let the situation evolve gradually," right? Unquote. So in regard to move one, the government is piggybacking on Pink Dot's social visibility and using Pink Dot as its homonationalistic mascot, right? So here I'm referring to homonationalism in its original sense by Jasbir Puar, where institutional state actors mobilize the LGBT cause to advance the self-interests of the state. So for the Singapore government to do this is not unusual, nor is it unprecedented, because in fact, it's speaking the language of the neoliberal global north back to itself, right? Where homonationalism, espoused particularly by states in the global north, has become a gold standard indexical of social progressivism and democracy. Homonationalism is also not alien to the Singapore government, as the authorities had themselves previously engaged in homonationalistic practices briefly in 2001 to 2004 themselves, right? And albeit for economic gain, and then subsequently retracted its homonationalistic practices when they felt it was getting a little too threatening and sort of challenging and rocking the boat somewhat. Although the Pink Dot organizers were justifiably affronted by Professor Chan's statements in the UN for the government's blatant manipulation of the movement in order to present itself favorably, right, to its international detractors, I think there is some mutual benefit to be had from this moment, right? So Pink Dot did receive implied public endorsement by a government it's had to historically tiptoe around. And it also allows Pink Dot to take to task the authorities their international proclamations of non and anti-discrimination against Pink Dot as a community, right? In a sense, it kind of gives Pink Dot some kind of protection in the future, right? In regard to move two, on the need for the evolution of society, however, the government's line is clearly drawn, right? So this is a position that falls back on values of social acceptance, consensus, and non-confrontation, right, as foundational tenets of Singaporean society. And so a politics of prudence must continue to be relevant whether or not homonationalism will be that preferred strategy, right? So although I expect it will continue to be so in some form, but that's open for discussion. To move on to the second question, the question is, how are discourses of assimilation in and around Pink Dot changing? What might this tell us about the shifting context of doing activism and dissent in Singapore, right? So I want to sort of just put this question in context in the first place, and that is the notion of assimilation is very much linked with the concepts of homonormativity and homonationalism, right? So from the point of view of institutional homonationalism, as described by Poor, the state objective to assimilate sexual minority experiences within normative structures is pretty clear. However, from the point of view of homonationalism deployed as pragmatic resistance by an LGBT community, my argument has been that it's not, and in fact, it's never been merely assimilationist, but tactical, right? So the nature of strategic assimilation is really, in my view, a form of ideological maneuvering and has allowed for Pink Dot's discursive elasticity in the way I've kind of described it in the commentary for the special issue. So we see this quite clearly in the Pink Dot Hong Kong case of ideological ambivalence that has been reported in the special issue by Raoul and Goal. But discursive elasticity has also been a feature of Pink Dot SG, right? So if again, if we sort of go back to what Lynette Chua has talked about in terms of characterizing Pink Dot's tactic as pushing the boundaries while towing the line. I think examples include Pink Dot's bold inscription of sexuality and gender into its rendition of Singapore's national pledge in 2019, right? So actually, Pink Dot came out very clearly, overtly, and sort of proclaimed and publicly that we, the citizens of Singapore, pledge ourselves as one united people, regardless of race, language, religion. These are the original words in our national pledge, but also inserted strategically sexual orientation or gender identity. Right? Another example is the recording of participants' open discontent at the government's ban of foreigners in Pink Dot's events in 2017, and also as outlined by Alfian in 2018, 2019, it's kind of progressively escalated, right? So expression of dissent, for sure, has been calibrated within Pink Dot's strategic assimilation over time. So the question is, has dissent or protest operated within Pink Dot's wider politics of prudence thus far? My response would be yes. Will Pink Dot jettison this discursive and actional mode of political organizing tactically in future? That, I think, remains to be seen, right? And so now just to deal with the very final question, and very briefly, really, because that I thought I might just be running out of time, is this question about are there other intersectional subject positions that could present new avenues of solidarities? That is to say, are there ways of articulating LGBT marginalization in relation to other minoritized constituencies in the country, right? And so how might this spark changes to modes of doing activism locally? So here I just want to briefly suggest two things. One is actually in some ways to think about the kind of visible cooperation among LGBT groups in Singapore, right? So here I'm thinking about a kind of the way Pink Dot and Ugachaga, for instance, provided a united response in the Straits Times sometime in September in the drafting of new workplace anti-discrimination laws against the LGBT community. And it's kind of nicely positioned the two groups together as a kind of a united front as within the LGBT community, right? And it provided that kind of visibility to the public. And a second way, I think, would be banding together with other minority and lobby groups in Singapore, for example, women, and in that regard with AWARE, also in terms of the disabled, the elderly, right, to combat shared concerns such as, sort of the current discussion and issues about workplace discrimination, right? And so I think that, again, is another opportunity to sort of work together on these kinds of shared concerns, but also sort of have the LGBT concerns also heard and sort of push the envelope further, right? But this would require a multi-pronged approach. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you, Michelle. That was really interesting. And thanks, Pavan, for preparing those 3 questions. I think what we can do now is maybe have some time to respond to what Alfian and Michelle have just said about the issue, about Pink Dot and LGBT activism in general. And then we'll have some time at the end to take questions. And you can start typing in your questions using the Q&A function now. One person has already used it, and we'll get to those questions soon. I think Rob would like to chime in immediately. Rob, go ahead.
Oh yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Alfian. Thank you, Michelle. Really appreciate your comments, and it's nice to meet you as well. Finally, yeah, Alfian, I really appreciate your history of Pink Dot. I have a question though for you, and that is, at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned the word hijack in terms of Pink Dot, and then you sort of took that back a little bit. And I'm wondering, could you say a little bit more about that idea of Pink Dot being hijacked? Like hijacked from what, I suppose, is the question.
No, sorry. I think that was very specific to the rhetoric around why the pink color was used.
Oh, okay.
So so this whole so from the pink triangle, and then later on, as you can see in their public messaging, pink was rather colors that were associated with state, right? Your pink identity card, as well as red and white of the national flag.
Okay. Yeah, the other thing that I was thinking about too, thank you for that, was when you were talking about Project X, right? And I think part of what that reminds me of is Audrey Yu's work on illiberal pragmatics, right? Which I think is a really interesting kind of connection, right? That idea of somehow sort of getting rid of sort of the messy aspects of being LGBT, right? That I think for many people outside of Singapore and even within Singapore, that being LGBT or having a queer subjectivity implies a lot more than just this idea of family, right? Or this idea of freedom to love within families. It's a lot deeper than that, right? And so I think this idea that the movement is still kind of working within this framework of illiberal pragmatics is very interesting to me, right? That it's still sort of going there. And I'm actually happy in a way to see, in 2018 when Pink Dot made the demands, right, so to speak. But I think too that the very phrase "we are ready" is still somehow kind of sheepish, right? Like it's not "we demand this, we demand that." It's "we're ready if you're willing to give it to us," right? In a way. So I just think that's interesting, right? To sort of think a little bit more about that, these sort of demands, and they were demands in a way, but soft demands, right? And I do wonder, as I think we all do here on this call, wonder what is the future, right? What does that future look like for Pink Dot, right? Is again, as people have already asked, what has changed? What is going to change? You asked, what is the goal, right? And that's for me, that's the $1 million question, right? Is it to repeal 377A? Is it to change social attitudes? Is it importing Western values into Singapore in terms of what it means to be LGBT? Whatever Western values are, right? Yeah, so those are my comments for you, for your portion. And for Michelle, again, thank you, Michelle, for your comments. Gave me a lot to think about, and I think especially your discussion of homo nationalism is very important here, because I think even in my own work, my recent work looking at the two different bodies of media discourse, right? The state media versus the online citizen. I see a lot of this homonationalism, and I see it pushing back against Islam, right? It's this kind of idea that I've been seeing in Singapore forever, that somehow Islam is foreign to Singapore, and somehow because it is foreign to Singapore, Muslims are somehow homophobic, right? They're not part of the so-called civilized West, right? And I think it sort of demonizes people that think differently, right? But I'm also reminded of probably 20 years ago, I think that somebody in Singapore made a statement about LGBT rights and getting rid of 377A. And the reasoning was that the Heartlanders can't handle it, right? So again, sort of pushing the blame, or pushing the reason we can't do this, right, is because Muslims couldn't handle it, the Heartlanders couldn't handle it, right? Pushing the blame from the government to other people. So yeah, that's really all I have for now. But yeah, those are my thoughts on both of your commentaries, and I appreciate them both very much, by the way.
Alfin,
Michelle
you're
or
muted.
Alfian, do you want to add something to that?
I think Alfin was speaking. Yeah.
So yeah, thanks so much for that, Robert. Just brief responses to a few of the things you mentioned. So yes, I do think we already sounds a little timorous, but at the same time, I think it's a response to a lot of government communications where the state basically says society is not ready, right? That we should let society decide, they should take the lead. The government is just following the lead of society, and if they're not ready, then government isn't ready either. When it comes to this issue of Project X, I think we can have quite an interesting and deep discussion about this, because I'd also like to tie it with other activist movements in Singapore. So if you look at AWARE, for example, the feminist organization in Singapore, they have also had to grapple with the fact that standing alongside, let's say, other lesbian women has proven to be a kind of liability for them, because it's made them vulnerable to attacks by certain conservatives who then say that accuse AWARE of being a lesbian organization, for example. And I there's this wonderful podcast which is called the Saga, which details this history, right, about how do you deal with certain segments of your community which you think might imperil the movement as a whole. Also with the climate movement in Singapore, so they were very careful, for example, to call themselves Singapore Climate Rally rather than Singapore Climate Strike, despite the fact that it drew its inspiration from that global movement. And then how did they deal with the fact that there were two students who then went on solo strikes, right? So they were holding placards and basically violating the Public Order Act in Singapore by striking, by not attending school, and having this public protest. So again, I think a lot of activist movements in Singapore, we are grappling with this issue. What does solidarity mean? And trying not to fall prey to attempts, I suppose, to divide and rule, and to have all this splintering, that's either based on ideology or tactics. Yeah. Thanks for that, Robert.
Right. So I think if I might just add to that point about we are ready. I think for me, I kind of read that not just as a kind of a proclamation from the LGBT community per se, but because of that kind of homo-nationalistic banner under which Pink Dot organizes. It's like saying Singapore is ready, right? Singaporeans are ready. So there's a kind of a slippage there that I think kind of works really well. So that again, it doesn't just kind of show them as a kind of, it's not just a kind of a section of the population, but all of us are together ready. So I don't know, that might just sort of add or be inflected into that as well. So thanks, Robert, about the again thinking about this notion of homo-nationalism in terms of Islam, the Heartlanders. the conservative Christian groups as well, right? So I think one of the things, I mean, I was kind of surprised actually to hear you say that from your corpus analysis, what you're actually finding is that Islam is seen as foreign to Singapore. So that was something that was quite, I mean, it kind of intrigues me because I think from my sense of it, it's very much part of the Singaporean fabric, right? So because of our multiracial, multi-religious sort of identity, Islam with Christianity as well, but that sense of religious pluralism is seen as very much part of that kind of multi-religious, multi-ethnic nationalism that needs to be protected, right? So if a section of a population, in this case, it might be the Muslims, or it might be the Christians, whoever it might be, it is still a section of the Singaporean population that is uncomfortable, like the Heartlanders. And so we need to sort of, at least the government needs to be responsible in sort of, looking to the concerns of the entire population rather than sort of pandering to a section. So I think, but I agree with that notion that it seems to be pushing the blame somewhat, right? Because as we know, the Singapore government can do whatever that it wants to do if it puts its mind to it, right? So in this case, it's kind of just sort of keeping it in that sort of a lukewarm position, not wanting to be being activist on behalf in that sense, or acting rather on behalf of the LGBT community. But I do think that it's a real concern as well. It's not just that the government is sort of using these sections as bogeymen, but the very fact that you did, have the Muslim quarter, the Christian quarter that is still very strong in this regard. And I think the Vincent's and Nie's paper in the special issue, right, sort of attests to that as well. So that it is an actual real concern that there are sections in Singapore that are uncomfortable, that the government would have to also manage. But also it's quite convenient that there are all these sections that are already doing that kind of dissent on their behalf. Yeah.
Could I ask a question to both Alfian and Michelle? Actually, Rob as well, because you were in Singapore and conducting field work, right? I think firstly, the point that Michelle makes is important. The idea that the line that the government likes to trot out, that society is not ready and so on. I think we need to take seriously that there is actually a substantial number of people who do hold those views, right? The response shouldn't be to just dismiss that as a false kind of claim. So with that sort of in mind, has there been at any point, Alfian, where you've thought that Pink Dot's growth, like from what 2,500 to 20,000 in the last physical iteration, has it ever struck you as too good to be true kind of thing? Like, it's, to my knowledge, it's the fastest growing social movement in Singapore, right? And so it's gone from 2,500 to 20,000 in a country that we probably should accept that, that it's a kind of a split. So is it a kind of symptom that about the sort of discourse that Pink Dot is activating and mobilizing, right? And what might that tell us about the effects of the movement? And it's kind of related, looking back now, right, on the last 12 years or so, do you think there's a sense that there's been a missed opportunity to re-signify what protest means? And I ask this because, for a long time, Pink Dot has distanced itself from protest. One of the lines on its website and its FAQ was that, this is not a protest, right? Yeah, and so that was a big thing. In fact, I think when they responded to Chan Heng Chee's statement to say that Pink Dot is a protest, I think that's the first time I noted Pink Dot kind of recognizing itself as protest. Okay, so I get it, right? I think I understand it's difficult. Doing activism in Singapore is difficult. The socio-political context is difficult. But do you think it's a missed opportunity to re-signify what protest could mean? Because as it stands, the hegemonic discursive construction of protest is dangerous. It might involve social disorder, rioting, all these sort of ideas are kind of conjured up as a spectre. But and by distancing itself from it, you kind of retain that fear, right, around protest. So if you call it a protest, you kind of delegitimize it. Whereas if it had kind of owned the concept of a protest, but done everything else in the same way, right? A picnic and performances and so on, it might have lessened what protest is or the fear factor around protest. So the question is, was it a missed opportunity to discursively contest protest as a category? Yes.
Thanks so much, Pavan, for those questions. So I think there are a few things, right? So this idea of the pink dot expanding year by year, and whether that's really truly reflective of whether you can see that as a microcosm of what's actually happening in Singapore society as a whole. I think I came across a recent survey that the data captured was at least 55% of the respondents were against the repeal of 377A. So one can argue there's still, quite a majority there. I do see what's happening at Pink Dot as a kind of theater, though, that there is a certain kind of symbolic significance there, that even though it might not match up to actual statistics out there as to how many people actually support gay people or support the repeal 377A, but at least visually, in terms of its optics, I think that there really is a sense that, oh, look, the dot is growing, it's spilling, and it had to put barricades. It can't contain this growth. So there's a certain kind of inexorability to it, right? So I think that's we can sort of like look at the symbolic value of Pink Dot and that kind of choreographed theater, as I mentioned. To your other point about whether there's a missed opportunity for Pink Dot to maybe remap the discursive terrain when it comes to the word protest, right? I do think, though, that it might be useful to look at who the audience is for when they say this is not a protest, because I feel that this is a kind of message that's directed specifically at the state. And there might be a kind of double discourse, right? So it's something that you say to the state, but actually, inwardly, privately among yourselves, you believe, oh, heck, this is a protest. But it's just the kind of messaging that I feel that they might, feel they strategically need to do in an authoritarian state, in case, it sort of sets off a few tripwires. So I think that's that, unfortunately. I think that's the kind of maneuvering that they've had to do. But I do think, other than the public messaging, I do feel some people, it's possible to articulate, oh, what's wrong protest? Pink Dot is a protest and it happens every year and it's non-violent, and people are having fun and blowing bubbles and having their dogs run around and passing out cupcakes, and that's also a protest. So I think just to sum it up, I'd say maybe this burden in re-articulating what protest is does not necessarily need to come from Pink Dot itself, because obviously the organizers are in a certain kind of dialogue with the state and authorities, but maybe it's the community at large and other Singaporeans that can take on this task.
I agree.
Oh, sorry, Michelle, go ahead.
Sorry, go. No, Adi, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, because I was going to take the conversation in a different direction.
Okay, so just to add on to what Elton mentioned, I think I agree that in a sense it was necessary, right? So it's not a missed opportunity. I think it is Pink Dot made very good use of the opportunity that was provided it at the time that it did, in the way that it organized itself, right? And I think the political necessity of that is really very central. And I think, the talking about protest and then saying that it's kind of a picnic and in the park is very confusing and conflicting as well for various sectors, I think, right? So I think one needs to have a sense of congruence and consonance in the way any event is organized so that people are able to understand and sort of make Pink Dot intelligible. Otherwise, it's too confusing as well. When you say, yeah, it's a protest, but it doesn't mean that protest has not been happening through Pink Dot since 2009, right? I think it has been happening in very small, little steps that it's been taking. It may not be recognizable as protest if we conceive of protest from a particular northern perspective, right? And I also think that it is dangerous to have that kind of protest writ large and wide in the Singapore context, precisely because, I mean, as Alfian mentioned, one needs to consider who your audience is. It is first and foremost the government, but also the public, right? Sort of, which involves both the straight as well as the queer public. So, and again, you've got a whole spectrum of people that you are addressing. What is the most broad-based politics that you can sort of mobilize without being shut down? I think is important, right? So, so that's one thing. The other thing, Pavan, I just wanted to mention, when you said that, yes, it seemed unusual to see Pink Dot mention on its Facebook, that, oh, we are a protest and so on. I think one needs to also maybe keep in mind things like, the genres and platforms, and again, the audiences of use, right? So if we're talking about the promotional videos and so on that Pink Dot does every year, who's that audience, and for much, the purpose, the genre of that is different from a Facebook post that directly addresses and says, hey, we don't appreciate the way, the government has manipulated the Pink Dot movement for its purposes in a statement. And I think that's not been unusual at all, right? So it has come up every now and then in various sorts of avenues. But the domain and the genres, I think, are also relevant in terms of the places of articulation.
I just want to respond to what you just said, Michelle, and then we have about 20 minutes to get to the questions that members of the audience have been so kind to send in. Going back to this idea of reconfiguring what protest means in Singapore, I'm just wondering if it's unfair to kind of think of this as trying to fit Pink Dot into a northern framework of what protest means. And I guess the discomfort here for me, first of all, is that it seems that if you are doing something that the state is comfortable with and accepting of and doesn't at all make the political elite uncomfortable, maybe we need another word than protest to describe it. So that's the first part of it. The second part is, and we do know there are things that make this government very uncomfortable, right? Like any kind of discussion of institutional racism, for example, that's just the mere mention of it is going to make the government very uncomfortable. But for some reason, talking about repealing 377A, at least in this moment, at some point of time, sure, but at least in this moment, is not very uncomfortable. And so when someone at Pink Dot holding a megaphone, I can't remember their name, shouts, "Mr. Lee, tear down this law," that suddenly doesn't really feel, even though it's said in an assertive tone, it doesn't feel like a protest, because it doesn't risk making our leaders uncomfortable. And the reason for that is because they started the conversation in a sense. So we're part of that conversation now on their terms. So Tony Tan starts talking about possibly repealing. You have some other members of the political elite who are starting to entertain this as an acceptable question. So it's no longer out of bounds. It's now something that you can legitimately talk about, and so that's something we grapple with as well in the introduction to the special issue. And And the second part of my well, I don't know if discomfort is too strong a word, but the second part is that we have a history of very, very antagonistic, oppositional forms of protest against the state, whether it's the colonial state or the newly independent state. And we do know what happens to that generation. So I guess maybe there's a bit of a contrast between a David Marshall type who goes to London and then says we're ready for independence, almost like we're ready, right, of today. And the difference between that and your left-wing unionists and politicians who, like from Satu or Barisan, who are very adamant, very in your face, and they're ready to be thrown into prison for years and years to get the freedom that they want. So that to me doesn't seem like a northern form of protest. So if it seems like that is the kind of protest and confrontation that was happening across the colonized world at the time. We know what happens to that generation. Our ruling elite today turns on them with the help of the British, and the Federation launches this wave of repression that throws hundreds of them into prison. So that's within living memory. We have, for some of us, we have parents, relatives who remember this moment in Singaporean history quite vividly. So at the same time, yeah, it's not easy to know how the state might respond and still react in an openly confrontational manner, which is why we get what someone like Lynette Chua calls pragmatic resistance. But then, with all of this said, with this historical antecedent, I'm not sure if I'm comfortable calling Pink Dot a protest, because then maybe we settle for that as the end all. Just a few thoughts.
Yeah, so I think it's very much kind of, which is sort of why I think Pink Dot began by, in 2009, sort of saying it's not a protest, but of course, now 12 years later, in relation to a very specific kind of a point that was made, it can come up and sort of say that, we have the LGBT community is being discriminated, sort of taking the government's words to task, right? So it's able to respond. It's not sort of saying that it's not skirting around the issue, because it's a very real issue that has been raised by the ambassador at large. And so Pink Dot is correcting the government's position, right? So on that kind of a platform. I just wanted to mention, I mean, whether it might be the word protest, it might be a dissent, it might be whatever that one might be using. I do wonder if, whether that could be a much more creative and a much more expanded and expansive way of thinking about these concepts, right? Because otherwise, I fear that we lock ourselves into monolithic understandings of protest or dissent, and there's only one way of doing these things. If not, a protest is not happening, for instance, right? Are there creative ways of protesting or dissenting and so on that takes into account that kind of socio-historical contingencies, I think, for me, become relevant. When Adi, you mentioned about, of course, Singapore is not, the kind of open confrontation with the government is not something that has never been, that's never happened before. Obviously it has, right, in terms of electoral politics. And I think the distinction also needs to be made between electoral politics and the politics of a social movement, right? And for the Singapore government, it's been very clear about, you want to sort of take a very strong oppositional, confrontational, anti-government kind of position if you want, then join the ranks of politics, electoral politics. You cannot be, you cannot talk politics from the margins, as it were, right? So these are kind of very interesting, I think, from a Singaporean perspective, because the government does set the parameters for discourse within Singapore. what can be said, what cannot be said. The parameters have been set. So it's not so straightforward to sort of say, I challenge the government in these sorts of ways. One has to take into account, because otherwise you just get shut down, right? And the fact that Pink Dot has survived 12 years, I mean, I think Pavan mentioned, or someone mentioned, right? Isn't that something that is kind of quite remarkable, isn't it? And that kind of visibility, that kind of whatever it might mean, I think these are very real concerns. And I just wanted to add one last point, and that is, I feel that when Chang Heng-chi, when Lee Hsien-loong, when they mention things like the LGBT community are not discriminated, these are being uttered as performative statements, right? So basically they are saying, what I say is true. It's not something that's negotiable, right? So it comes to pass by the very act of making these statements. And I think sometimes the frustration is with statements like these, because you can sort of, show a whole list of discrimination and harassment and violence, but you're showing it to a speaker for whom this is not intelligible, because I've already spoken, I've already said there is no discrimination, right? So it's a very interesting, I think, way of dealing with the sort of elite state actors in Singapore. So I'll give the floor over to Alfian and the others now.
Actually, let's move on to something else, because I realize we're running out of time, and so we should get to some of these questions people have sent in. But to transition from what Michelle has just said, thinking about Chan Heng-chi's comments, the government doesn't discriminate against LGBT, the LGBT community. So what does the government mean by LGBT? And it seems that actually a lot of the discussion misses the T in the equation. And so we have two questions about what Pink Dot might be missing, or what these discussions might be missing. So the first, I'll read it out, is given Michelle's discussion of assimilation and Alfian's discussion of palatability to make Pink Dot family-friendly and hetero-friendly, how inclusive is Pink Dot in representing the full spectrum of the LGBTQ+ community? Are certain identities, especially trans people, equally visible and celebrated as part of this project of legibility and awareness, or are they further marginalized, albeit unintentionally, in favor of a certain kind of homonormativity? And I'm going to read the other question as well, which is different, but somewhat related. Hi, Alfian. Thank you very much for this brief mapping of Pink Dot's history. I wanted to ask what your thoughts are on Pink Dot also being a kind of Chinese middle/upper class expression, which you briefly alluded to, as well as how it's co-opted into the pink dollar. I personally think it is difficult to avoid capitalism and its desires, but it doesn't mean Pink Dot's efforts are necessarily nullified or made less meaningful. How else could we at the time, how else could we at the same time, though, think of creatively resisting in relation to the pink dollar? Okay, so this question you should be able to see in the Q&A, and I'll post the other question as well in case you want to read it. So does anyone want to have a go?
Maybe I'll deal with that second question, right? Since it's directed at me. Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I'll probably start by saying that one of the reasons that I stepped away from Pink Dot by the time I was like 2011, I believe, was because there was this dominance of a certain group of people in leadership and decision-making positions in Pink Dot. And my critique of Pink Dot was that, yeah, it was dominated mostly by men, gay Chinese men who, middle class, English speaking. And I was at some point also a little bit concerned. I was often either the only or one of two brown people in the room. So I felt like in terms of their diversity, they needed to bring in more voices and more perspectives. and of course, I was quite critical of how Pink Dot became, increasingly more commercialized. They were getting a lot of corporate sponsorships, and then they were having Apple and Google and Barclays and all that on board. And I remember in 2013, I went to Pink Dot, not in pink, but in some other random color. I held up a placard that said, queerness is not commercialized, queerness is not commodified, queerness is radical. And that became sort of my critique of Pink Dot. But interestingly, the year after, my position changed because of the counter movement, because of Wear White. And I think this was an interesting kind of journey for me, because I think that kind of internal critique, internal dissent and all that is very, very important. It's one way to continually be self-reflexive, right? But at the same time also, in the face of this quite serious opposition, it didn't make sense for me to fracture, to factionalize, and maybe some other people might think differently. Some people might question what then is the worth of your solidarity, if you have to come together just in the face of some external threat. But I want to say that it is inevitable sometimes that certain movements start off by being spearheaded by people who are very privileged, who are very elite. But hopefully along the way, you sort of try to expand and try to include other people. So Singapore Climate Rally also, if you see the messaging, they started off, a lot of them university educated graduates or undergraduates. And then recently they've expressed solidarity, for example, with workers who are affected by the petrol hikes, for example, right? So they become a little bit more socialist in that way. And I suppose, I don't have immediate questions at hand, but the whole idea about, pink dollar capitalism, I think it'd be interesting also for Pink Dot to try to imagine what forms of pink socialism might look like, what forms of redistribution might also be possible. Yeah, because definitely I think the queer movement has capitalized on the pink dollar quite a bit in its initial years, basically to say that, if you discriminate against gay people, then you're kind of like losing out on foreign talent or investments, etc. Right? So that has formed the crux of that argument. But I think it has kind of shifted away from profit towards principle. Gradually, we see that happening, and hopefully also, maybe they can kind of gradually delink from the pink dollar, and as you mentioned, all these capitalist desires. But I think it's a very broad church, Pink Dot, and I don't see any problems. I feel if there are certain groups that want to, let's say brown queer groups or working class queer groups that want to, set up a booth in Pink Dot, I do not think they will be rejected. It's more a question of like who will then initiate these other groups. Yeah.
That's very interesting, Alfian. I think part of it is kind of deciding, as you say, what's your solidarity worth, but also, I suppose, what price are you willing to pay for your solidarity? And in some cases, some of us don't want to pay that price. What about the first question? Does anyone want to have a go at thinking through the first question about the inclusiveness of Pink Dot representing the full spectrum of the LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah, I could just sort of say something in relation to that. I think, again, it's really illuminating to hear Alfian speak from within the perspective, right, of how Pink Dot has organized itself, and from the point of view of the organizers themselves. And I think what came to mind is really this notion that any social movement, right, is like the feminist movement, second wave and so on. It's always sort of they fall prey to this whole dynamics of privilege and who has the voice and the platform to speak and so on. And there is always a stratification within groups, right? And so it really depends on whose, in that sense, interests get heard, and then therefore represents the entire community. So I think this is something that is quite common, not just in Pink Dot, in any social movement, in any kind of groups, I think, of heterogeneity, this is prone to happen. And I think that's something that in any social movement there needs to be that kind of self-circumspection as well in dealing with this. And I think so that's one thing in terms of what's actually going on behind the scenes in the way that Alfian has mentioned. From my perspective, sort of looking at really just the discourses that have come out and been put out from Pink Dot, I would say actually the opposite is true, right? So it's very clear in my, at least from looking at it, it's very careful to sort of represent diversity. And so the transgender community is as much represented in Pink Dot's publicity materials as gays and lesbian, queer, the whole sort of, as much as the spectrum, as people can interpret and read, right? The kind of diversity that there is. And I think recently there was, I think, is it Ire Aman, who also came forward and was actually speaking about, being brown and queer and speaking to that section of the community as well, right? So again, this might be, the time might be right now in terms of trying to address those kinds of issues of pluralism within Pink Dot.
Thank you, Michelle. We have time for one last question. We're gonna just read this one out. And I'm sorry to everyone whose question we didn't manage to get to, but they were all very interesting. So this one is by Gary Lee, and that question is has to do with Pink Dot's relationship to Singapore's recent post-colonial reckoning. They're thinking of the bicentennial and Singapore's. So sorry, they've repeated themselves here. So they're thinking about the bicentennial and Alfian's edited collection, Merdeka. Alfian, maybe you can tell us a little bit about that as well. And the question is, does revisiting Singapore's relationship with its colonial past open a way to depart from a homo-nationalist frame? And maybe just a comment to modify that question. It's not just a colonial past, it's a colonial present, particularly in a country like Singapore, where race is still managed in a very colonial manner. And we still have, in my opinion, the equivalent of indentured workers, thinking about how Singapore exploits its migrant workers, particularly in construction and domestic housework. Alfian.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think we can sort of draw some reference to the case of the decriminalization of Section 377 in India, for example, and the way that was argued as something that was part of the whole project of decolonization, right? You got to throw away this law because it's a colonial law. And I do feel that if Singapore society had more decolonial impulses and energies, that could have worked. I don't know whether some of the arguments in court are utilizing that as an argument, in terms of the constitutional challenges. But definitely I think that might offer us a certain kind of understanding of Section 377A. And also maybe even looking at the pre-colonial past, right? And trying to trace whether there were other forms of like queer subjectivities that predated in colonial presence, that predated some of the religions that we see in Singapore. Yeah, although that I think is always a little bit of a tricky maneuver, trying to reclaim certain things from that past, because sometimes you can be a bit presentist, right? And sometimes you can impose certain meanings of homosexuality that might not have been really experienced by those people in the past. Yeah.
Michelle, Pavan, Rob, do you want to add anything to that?
I would just say that, I think there's a little bit of a risk when one talks about that kind of colonialism, kind of also a neo-colonialism, which I think might also be behind the sort of concern about, kind of, especially kind of decriminalizing that kind of same-sex relations and so on, because it kind of also, steps on waters to do with, Westernization in relation to Asianism and these kinds of things, where there seems to be a kind of a sense that maybe being queer, although I don't think that the government necessarily thinks this, that it's it's a Western construct, right? I don't think that's necessarily the case, but I think it might open the door to a kind of a society that might undermine an Asian way of thinking and living and that kind of stuff. So I think one needs to, temper that discussion of a kind of a colonial past and present with that fear as well of a kind of self governance as an Asian community in relation to always the fear that that the government has about the specter of foreign intruders, right, affecting and shaping and kind of misdirecting Singaporean society. And I think that is something that is certainly present.
All right, I think on that note, we're gonna close here. It's 11 o'clock. Thank you to our panelists and particularly Michelle and Alfian for taking the trouble to read through the issue, think deeply about the questions and themes that we bring up, and present all of these very productive comments and questions. And thanks as well to Pavan and Rob for being a part of this discussion and part of the project as well, and to all of our contributors, some of whom have been listening in on this call. And thank you very much to the Center for hosting us and for helping organize this. Laura, Jonathan, Monique, Dohi, Hugh, thank you so much for all of your hard work. And thank you for everyone for attending. Have a good night or good day wherever you are in the world.